So now we're ready to add something else to our file. So we're going to go to File, Open, and we are going to select the seagull image. I click on it, click Open. I'm going to click on the tab, drag down and over. Make sure that my Move tool is the active tool. Click on what I want to move, hold my mouse down, and release when the cursor is over where I want that to be moved to. And you'll notice that the seagull image, all the white just magically disappears. And that's because it's been saved in a special kind of file format called PNG. And PNG allows you to save images with transparency, which is why it's a very popular format for use on the web. So returning back to our document, what we want to do is we want to make it look like the skull is just about to land, and you can see his feet are outstretched. But right now he's a little large compared to the scuba figure, so we're going to press Command T to transform. We're going to hold our Shift key and click and drag on a corner handle. I'm going to make him a little smaller, and then reposition him so he's a little closer to the sand. The next thing I want to do is I want to create a shadow. And shadows are always mirror images, and the way that shadow looks really depends upon where the position of the sun is in the sky. So if the sun is very high in the sky, it tends to be quite short and quite tight, and if the sun is lower on the horizon, shadows tend to elongate. So I'm going to move my layer palette a little closer to the action just so you can see what's going on. The first thing we want to do is rename our seagull layer and press Enter to enter in that change. And then we're going to find a different way to work with selections. What I can do right now is Photoshop knows where there's pixels and where there aren't pixels on that layer. And I can ask Photoshop to create a selection based on that information. And I'm just going to hide the other layers before I continue so you can see what's going on. And this is called loading a layer as a selection. And to do that, I hold down my Command key and I click on the layer thumbnail. And you'll notice that I've got a selection exactly around the shape of the gull. So again, that's hold Command, click on that little layer thumbnail, and now I've got a perfect selection. My next step is to create a new layer by pressing on the New Layer button. And even though I have a new layer, I still have that active selection that can be applied to that brand new layer. The next thing I want to do is I want to change my foreground color to black. And I'm going to do that by clicking on that little icon. And now you can see that black is my foreground color, and that means if I want to paint or use a paint bucket tool, etc., that's the color that's going to be used. The next step is to select the paint bucket tool. By clicking on it, it shares a spot with the gradient tool, so if you don't see paint bucket, look for gradient. You'll find it there. And with the paint bucket tool selected, ensuring that layer 1 is the active layer, I click once with the paint bucket inside that selection area, and it's filled with black. I press Command D to deselect, and I reselect my Move tool. Shadows are always mirror images, so what we need to do is we need to flip this black silhouette image in our document to start creating that shadow effect. So I want to make sure that my shadow layer is the active layer, and I'm going to shift it slightly down from that original image it's on top of, just so you can see what's going on. And then we're going to go to the Edit menu, to the Transform area, and we are going to select Flip Vertical. And when I click and drag and reposition our shadow, you'll see that it is a mirror image. Now, shadows are rarely this crisp along the edges, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to blur it slightly. And we're going to do that by going to our Filter menu and selecting Blur and Gaussian Blur. And you want to make sure that the little preview button in that dialog box is checked so that as you click and drag the slider and change the radius value, you can see how it's affecting that layer in your document. Now when you're working with shadows, you don't want it so blurry that it almost disappears. So our goal is to just take a little bit of the crispness off of the edges of that silhouette. So now it's looking a little more like a shadow. And before we do anything else, let's take a moment to name that layer shadow. Pressing enter to enter in that change. And then we're going to move the shadow layer underneath the gull. And then reposition the shadow so it's aligned. Shadows aren't usually perfect mirror images. They tend to distort, elongate, or contract depending upon the position in the sun. So we're going to press Command T, and this time we're actually going to click and drag a middle handle because we do want to distort that image. So now that I've distorted it, adjusting the position slightly, my next step is to make it less black. Right now the shadow is so dense that we can't see any of the ground that it's falling on, and that's typically not what shadows look like. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our layer palette. We're going to make sure that the shadow layer is active, and we're going to change the layer opacity. Now 100% opacity means we can't see through anything, but if we adjust that opacity to a lower level, then we can start to see things through the shadow. There's a couple of different ways you can adjust the opacity value. One is to click and hold and drag the slider. The other is to type in a number into the field, or what you can do is you can click in that little field where it says the percentage and use your up and down arrow key to increase or decrease that value. And once we've positioned our gull and our shadow exactly where we want in our composition, we're going to unhide those layers that we hid previously. Before we complete our work with the gull, there's one other little trick you might want to know. We've taken the time to position the gull and the shadow relative to one another very carefully, but if I decide I want the gull somewhere else in my composition, I can actually go to my layer palette, click on the gull layer, hold my shift key and click on the shadow layer, and then I can click and drag and move both of them at the same time. Okay, we're going to add one additional image. We're going to go to File, Open, and this time we are going to select the Surfer Girl. We're going to click and drag down on the tab and over to the right. We're going to make sure that our Move tool is the active tool. We're going to click and hold and drag and release the cursor when it's over the area we want to add the image to. I'm going to zoom in and we're going to take a look at this image, and for the most part there's a lot of good contrast between the figure and that white background. But we've seen this problem before when we have a lot of white and there's a white background. We know that we can't really use the Magic Wand tool to do everything. So we're going to start off by using our Magic Wand tool to select the white background. We're going to change the tolerance to 32 and click on the white. Then we're going to select our eraser tool, and we're going to use it to erase around the area of the figure. As I get close to the surfboard, I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally erasing part of the surfboard, because we're going to use a different method of editing around that portion of the image. Then I'm going to press Command D to deselect. I'm going to decrease the size of my brush, and I'm going to start to use my shift click trick to very carefully erase around the edges of the surfboard. And I'm not going to walk you through each click. I'm going to allow you to do that on your own. Now that we have our surfer image erased, we're going to want to reposition it within our composition, and since she's surfing, it probably makes sense to position her where there's a wave in the scene. And we also have to decrease her size because she's further away, therefore she appears to be smaller. So we're going to press Command T to transform, hold our shift key, click and drag on a corner and make her smaller, and press enter to enter in that change. Right now the angle of the board doesn't look quite right. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our transformation command not to make this bigger or smaller, but to rotate the image. And to do that, what we do is we press Command T to transform, and then we position our cursor just outside one of the corner handles, and when we click and drag, we'll see the image start to rotate. Now whenever you're in transform mode, and especially in rotation, the image starts to look really strange and pixely, but once you apply that transformation by hitting enter, all the original quality is restored. So we're done our tutorial, but what I'm going to ask you to do is add 3 additional images to this scene. I want to see all the original objects that we edited during the course of this tutorial present in your final submitted file, but I'm going to ask you to add your own images to the scene as well. And that's it.